And we are live at the WGBH studio in the Boston Public Library. I'm usually a radio person on the air once a week with Living Lab Radio, and I am so excited to be here. Can we get a little noise? We've got folks here at the library with us. Hi, everybody. We are here as part of the Great American Read, a PBS initiative celebrating the power of reading. And the folks at PBS have identified 100 of America's favorite books, and they're asking you to vote on your favorites too. You can do that voting on our website, WGBH.org. As part of the Great American Read, we're here at WGBH. We've been doing a series of Facebook Lives, and today we are here to explore the genre of science fiction, although we're going to broaden that out a little bit and talk just about science storytelling in general, diving deep into the world of how writing and reading about science can influence public perceptions of science, scientists, and the world around us and what we know about it. So we have a fabulous panel here today. I'm going to start down at the end. We have Meredith Goldstein. She is author of the Love Letters Advice column for the Boston Globe. She's also the author of a young adult novel called Chemistry Lessons that features a budding chemist living in Cambridge. So we will talk about that one a little bit more later. Next to her, we have Tom Levinson of MIT. He's a professor of science writing in MIT's graduate science writing program, and author of The Hunt for Vulcan, and the recipient of the Walter P. Kistler Science Documentary Film Award. So not just writing about science, also making movies about science, I guess. Next to him, Caitlin Greenidge, a Radcliffe Fellow and author of her debut novel, We Love You, Charlie Freeman, taking on issues of institutional racism within the sciences and more broadly in our culture. Really intriguing and thought-provoking. And finally, right next to me here, Joelle Renstrom of Boston University. She's a professor of writing, and her collection of essays closing the book, Travels in Life, Loss, and Literature, was published in 2015. She's also the robot columnist at the Daily Beast, and her work has appeared in Slate, The Guardian, Cognoscenti, and others. A particular devotee of robots and space, you said, right? Kind of the bread and butter of science fiction there. You can join our conversation on Facebook Live. We would love to have your questions and comments. We'll be taking those and answering them throughout our conversation. We'd also like to hear from you. What are some of your favorite science fiction books or books about science in general? To start our conversation, right, I think we need to kind of define what it is we're talking about. And Tom, I'm going to say science writing when we're in the factual realm.
Yes.
Is probably the most cut and dry, right? We're trying to maybe explain science, tell how we know what we know, but it's factual science writing, right?
It actually is at its best much more than that. I mean, yes, explanatory science writing is both, the bread and butter in some ways of popular science writing, and really wonderful, and can take really extraordinary, literary forms. But science writing is like any other kind of either journalistic writing or essayistic writing. You're using science to understand something about the world. So you should be writing through science to the experiences we all have.
So true storytelling that just happens to be about science.
Or have some connection to science, indeed.
Which then gets us into the much broader and harder to define realm of science fiction, which I guess if you just took those two words at face value, it would be some sort of fiction writing that has something to do with science. But we have, I think, these more defined ideas of what science fiction is, but we don't necessarily all have the same ideas. So Joelle, why don't we start with you? What's kind of your working definition of what is science fiction?
I don't know that I even have a working definition at this point. I think anything that my students or any readers want to consider science fiction, like, okay. Because at this point, it's just speculative fiction, that question of what if blank happened, or what if we made blank, So that can be fantasy too, that can be sci-fi. So for me, the way I think about sci-fi is that I split it between hard and soft, right? Hard sci-fi is the really technical stuff that probably has more science in it. Softer sci-fi the science is more in the background. So you don't know how the colony got to Mars or what science they used to get there. But now we know they're there, and now we care about what happens. And so a lot of the really popular sci-fi, like Star Wars, some people consider to be more space opera than actual science fiction. I don't care. I think it all works regardless of how plausible, at least for me, the science is. Because at the end of the day, these stories are all about people, no matter how you slice it. So that's why I don't distinguish all that much, but other people might.
Caitlin, how about you?
I mean, I would agree. I think what's so exciting about something like speculative fiction is that we get to imagine sort of different possibilities, different sorts of worlds, which I think is sort of at the heart of what draws a lot of people to science to begin with, sort of the great expansion of knowledge and just multiple different ways you can look at our natural world, at our physical world, sort of all these sorts of things that people are drawn to when they are studying science as a subject. I see that being applied to the world of fiction when people are drawn to reading speculative fiction, writing speculative fiction, and sort of the best speculative fiction really takes pieces of our world as a jumping off point to imagine something completely new and completely different.
All right, Tom, because you already started saying that you don't think that the lines of factual science writing are as cut and dry as I was implying. So where's the line there, and what is science fiction in your mind?
Science fiction is, science fiction is what a writer or a reader says it is. I mean, in the end, as a writer, you put stuff out in the world, and the reader gets to decide what they think of it. I think the hard and soft distinction is useful. Joe Haldeman writing The Forever War, which is a spectacular book. I mean, really, if you haven't seen it yet, it's now 40 years old at least, maybe almost 50. It's meticulous in its science. Its plot is the engine of its plot is general relativity, and yet it's a novel about the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's almost not explicitly. That's the beauty of its fiction. So how would you call that science fiction? Well, of course you do. Do you call that a great war, sort of a disguised war memoir? Yeah, you could. And similarly, Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, the science in that is fictional. It's a relativity of time. So you can do the device that is sort of the MacGuffin in the book is something that allows you to not traverse space without using time, but to communicate across space, vast reaches of space without taking any time. And that's a complete MacGuffin. There's no such science, but it is born of very rigorous thinking about what such science would mean if it could exist. And that's science fiction too. I mean, it goes from one end of the world to the other. Universe.
All right, so Meredith, you are by day an advice columnist for the Globe.
Not a scientist.
And yet you dove into this world writing a book with science characters and, some speculative science.
Yeah.
Could we try to essentially invent love potion number 9?
Yes.
Could we make somebody, invent something that would make someone love us? A classic question in the human condition. I mean, did you think you were setting out to write science fiction?
Well, first of all, when you get letters from the lovelorn all day and people are saying, I want to be able to have control over something that's uncontrollable. I want to have control over my love life, whether people love me back, whether I'm attractive. You start to wonder, I wonder what if we could control that, right? And I also saw a real wave of dating apps taking off when I was writing this book where companies were clearly trying to find the right science and formula for finding your right partner. And some of these companies use DNA. In fact, there's a new one called Pheromore, where you are matched with people with similar or complementary pheromones. So when I started writing this book, it really was rooted in a lot of science I was reading and thinking, well, what if love potion number 9 was a thing, but it was in a lab? And so for me, the greater challenge was not being a scientist and not knowing that world. What was the culture of science I was writing about? And, what are the ethics involved? If you can make someone love you, should you? Yeah. It's a nice breakup fantasy, but I really wanted to explore whether it's something we should really want.
And clearly the science aspect of it for you was not too off-putting. I mean, you did a ton of research, you went and shadowed in labs, and you kind of dove right in.
Yeah, and I was shocked at how many things I had been wrong about. What I thought scientists would be like. I was delighted with how social they were with each other. I shadowed 2 different labs, one at MIT, one at New England Medical Center Tufts, and how interested in each other's projects people were. It just how international the rooms were. And I was really able to get a sense, especially for a young woman character in science, what the world was like for women in those labs. And I really wanted to write a story where that was normalized, where I wasn't talking about somebody's journey as a woman with obstacles. This was her life. Her mother was a scientist. All the women in her family were scientists, and she was excellent at it, and that part was already established. So to meet so many incredible women in these labs who taught me so much, it was pretty inspiring.
I mean, I love what you say there, that it kind of defied your own stereotypes
Oh, my
as you
gosh.
went in of the geeky, socially inept scientist who's just doing their thing, and she's got a little bit of that, the main character.
A little bit,
Has
but
a best friend who helps keep her up on pop culture a little bit.
Yes.
But yeah, she's not a stereotype.
no, and she's got great friends, and she's got friends with different interests, and that's what I really took out of it, which was, these are not one-track mind people. In fact, a lot of the scientists I met were interested in their field because they were so interested in the entire world and how people lived, and I wanted to show that. I will say that everyone was so well dressed in the lab I went to at MIT that I was like, well, this people should know. Like just stylish and like fashion forward. So I was like, you know what?
It's not a universal character.
Not everyone at MIT is necessary, although we are loving your shirt.
Yes.
Thank you.
So, Caitlin, in your novel, I mean, you are taking on major social issues and history. How central is it to the premise of your writing and what you want to do in terms of social criticism that it also involves a family that's taking part in a scientific study? I mean, in some ways, you could maybe accomplish that with them doing any number of activities, right?
Well, for me, it was super interesting to talk about the history of scientific racism, in part because one of the best classes I took as an undergrad was a class on the historiography of medicine. I was a history major, but this was a whole new way to think about science and sort of tracking how ideas form and continue to come up again in certain cultures and die and come back, and sort of all the different ideas that are discarded on the way towards scientific knowledge. And also in a undergrad class, we read Stephen Jay Gould's Mismeasure of Man, which is a great book that does all of that. It's tracking the history of eugenics, and particularly the kind of the myths that we have around intelligence and IQ tests in this country. And Stephen Jay Gould is a brilliant science writer, really tracks that very easily for a reader, even for someone who is not necessarily has a background in science like myself, and pushes the book one step further to say, well, why do these ideas come back again and again? Why, even if something is disproven by science over and over again, that idea remains so attractive to a certain segment of society that it just keeps coming back, and people keep arguing this idea, even when we've, there's books and books and reams of research that goes against this. And so for me, that's like a very human question, why we hold on to certain myths or certain narratives or certain stories, even when it has been disproven, even when it's proven actually to serve very few people in society. Why do we keep coming back to these stories? And so that's kind of one of the questions that is explored in the book. And one of the primary kind of questions that were pushing me forward, and a question that I come back to whenever I'm sort of reading popular science articles, or whenever there's sort of, we live in a culture now where every few weeks somebody will say, we've discovered this brand new thing, and then everybody will have like a debate about whether or not it's real or not or whatever, and then it'll just die. And then 2 weeks later, we've discovered a brand new thing, and then everyone just, so for me, it's helpful to kind of parse through all of sort of that frenzy that happens around people's excitement over new knowledge, to figure out how does it fit into this larger story that we have about certain ideas that come back and have an ebb and flow through our cultures.
You've hit on one of my favorite topics in science journalism, but we're going to take a quick pause here, a quick breath to let anyone who's just joining us know that we are live at WGBH's studio at the Boston Public Library, taking on the topic of science fiction and science writing, how it informs our ideas about science more generally as part of PBS's Great American Read. We are broadcasting live on Facebook, and we are loving getting your questions and comments and would love to hear more from you. We have a question from Patrick, who says, do you ever get pushback from purists who dismiss sci-fi as a lesser form of fiction or writing? Oh, Joelle with the eye roll there. Let's start with you.
Not anymore.
Really?
No. I mean, it depends who your audience is. And I think decades ago, sci-fi was seen as pulpy or not super legitimate. Honestly, I don't know anybody who thinks that way about it anymore, especially because just look at all the stuff that was in sci-fi back in the day and how much of it has actually transpired. I mean, it's not that all science fiction writers are fortune tellers or anything like that, but it's very, very clear that their ideas, not just about science and technology, but about society and politics and just humanity in general, are pretty spot on. And
can you give us some examples? What are some of your favorite examples where somebody managed with their science fiction to kind of predict what the future would end up being?
Ray
Because the
Bradbury.
Jetsons did not work out, unfortunately.
I go immediately to people like Ray Bradbury, who wrote. So he's a soft sci-fi writer. He wasn't really concerned about the technological details, but in The Martian Chronicles and Fahrenheit 451, government censorship, people controlling, what you read, trying to control what you think about. His book, The Martian Chronicles, who gets to go to Mars? And what do they do there? And are they going to screw it up just like we have on Earth? So just these questions that at one point seemed really fanciful, and Asimov writing about, human-robot relationships, these seemed entirely fantastical at one point in time. They very clearly aren't anymore. And NASA, Intel, a lot of other companies and organizations constantly hit up sci-fi writers for ideas. How could we use this application? Or what do you think we should do about this problem? So I think it's pretty clear at this point, especially with how, sci-fi has become very, very popular, that it is just as legitimate as any other genre. So, yeah. And I'm also teaching college students who would never suggest that sci-fi is anything other than, enjoyable and legit. So I don't get that pushback anymore. Maybe early on, but not anymore.
Tom, do you want to jump in on that one?
Well, sure. And first of all, I want to, two cheers for the Jetsons, because, the Jetsons actually have proved to be strikingly true when you think about it. It wasn't we don't have flying cars.
We don't have flying cars. I guess we do have Roombas. I don't have a full-on robotic house cleaner yet. I guess that, for me, is the important part. I don't have a full-on robotic house cleaner yet.
But what that show was really about was the persistence of habits in new circumstances. They were 50s ideal, suburban, white family living in a middle-class, as imagined existence. And the persistence of that as an ideal, that's very much still with us, Yeah, it was dressed up beautifully, and I loved the Jetsons as a kid. But, I guess that's sort of my point, is that, any good work of writing, any good work of art is about what it's obviously about, and it's about something else as well. And the Jetsons was about more than just, whether or not you get your flying car.
About the technology
right.
of the flying car.
I think, look, there's a long, long history of writing, fiction about ideas. And over the last 100 years, those ideas have been, the ideas that have really, I think, challenged people a lot are ideas from science and from the impact of different technologies on everyday experience. So, I think you could make I'm not sure I would go all the way down this road, but I think you make a very good argument that science fiction is simply literature now. It's just fiction, and it might be the leading stream of fiction because we live in a world that is so conditioned by all the ways that both deep scientific ideas and their applications in everyday technology, change the way we experience each other, change the way we, do everything.
So I was looking at the Great American Read list at what they have on there is the sci-fi and fantasy selections, and we are going to talk about Frankenstein. Joel, I know you're ready to talk about Frankenstein, but it was dawning on me as I was looking at Frankenstein, 200 years old, and still I can say it to my young kids, and sure, they have some misperceptions and misconceptions about what Frankenstein is, but it's a single word that we can say to pretty much anybody 200 years after that book came out, and we have ideas about what that means. I mean, that's really pervasive. And it occurred to me that that's 200 years old. How old actually is the tradition of factual science writing when you're not talking about the scientists writing their own work? I mean, we've got Newton in the Principia, we've got Darwin in On the Origin of Species, but when did non-scientists start writing about science for the public?
Well, if I can jump in, if you look at the explosion of printed works after Gutenberg does his Bible in I'm blanking on the date. Anyway, in the first 50 years after it, you get something like Europe goes from a few thousand physical books to a few million. And a substantial portion of those are books that we would recognize as, in that context, science books. A lot about medicine, how to do agriculture, so forth and so on. So there's a lot of, people want to know how to figure out the world or do things in the world or be practical in the world. And that's been there since, the birth of popular writing. Priestley was a science popularizer in the 18th century, as well as being an important scientist. And he wrote about other stuff than his own. There's a long, I don't know the traditions in languages other than English nearly as well as I should, but I bet you'd find plenty of stuff in French or Italian or what have you.
It's older than I was thinking.
I think so,
is
yeah.
the short answer
Yeah.
to that question. So let's go back to Frankenstein, Joel, because, as I said, 200 years old and completely pervasive. What is the impact that you see, or impacts, pick your first top three, that you see of Frankenstein on our society today?
Well, I think, one of them would just be the impact that it's had on the genre as a whole, because it was the first man-made life form in fiction, which kind of gives rise to robot fiction and all kinds of man-made others that Asimov, everything in the genre that's around robots, and that raises that central question of, should we create artificial life, which obviously, has a lot of relevance today, especially when it comes to, for me, the scientist as sole decision maker. Because one thing that I think is super interesting about Frankenstein is that obviously, he is a student of science, and he's somebody with a personal motivation, so his goal at first is just trying to, I think, banish death, not violent death. He's trying to get rid of disease, right? For personal reasons, because he's had some grief and some people die, right? And we all get that because scientists are all motivated, largely
universal
motivated.
Human condition, again.
Absolutely. But what Frankenstein doesn't do is think about consequences and doesn't has a minute of thinking, maybe I should try my thing out on a smaller organism. And then he's like, no, I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to make a person or a person-like thing, not a mouse, not, something smaller, and just goes for it and looses this thing onto the world. So besides the contribution to the genre, I would say the decision making without consequence, but then he just completely refuses to take responsibility for his creation. He looks at it and is sort of like, oh, this thing is ugly. Smell you later, And then this being is out there in the world like an abandoned child, and like an abandoned child gets some unfortunate ideas about society but Victor never fixes it, and so I think, and in fact, only makes things worse. So I think just in terms of that lesson of, if you're making a decision that's going to affect other people, maybe you ought not to make it by yourself and with your own personal glory as motivation. And number two, if you do something that doesn't have the intended consequence, burying your head in the sand is probably not the right reaction to that.
I mean, to me, that strikes me as kind of the other end of the spectrum from sci-fi that's maybe predicting or looking into the future of opportunities, and it's the ultimate cautionary tale about the potential pitfalls of maybe, hopefully, stereotypically how science has been done, and hopefully is not done in most cases at this point. But it gets to the point that Michael Bernstein, a sci-fi writer who joined our Facebook Live, said, keep in mind that science fiction doesn't just sometimes predict the future, but can also influence the future, maybe with cautionary tales. And then he also, as you have brought up, robots inspired by Asimov, and the Apollo team being influenced by Heinlein. So, I mean, I guess it's a little harder to know when it's the cautionary tales that are influencing the future, as opposed to being able to say, oh yeah, this prediction came true, but there is that potential there. Do you think, actually, Tom, I wonder from your perspective, does the factual science writing have that same power? Or is there something in the speculation and the fictionalizing that gives us a little bit more power to weigh in on society?
I think, again, I believe that it's easy sort of to draw lines around things like science writing or science fiction, nonfiction science writing, and so forth, in ways that we don't say about business writing. There are novels that are really focused on what happens in, as you try to get and spend, and we don't think of those as sort of distinct from the business of just trying to write about how we live in the world. So. For me, nonfiction science writing is very much about influencing the future, mostly by changing the way we think about our past and present. And I think it does that in the same way that any factual writing on any subject, has relationship to its fictional representations. So there are novels, for example, of environmental dystopias. When it's all gone wrong. There's this week's extraordinary piece of retrospective writing in the New York Times Magazine about when we had a chance to solve climate change and what it means that we didn't. Do those both such treatments? I mean, I'm going to get the name wrong. Paolo Baglialupe. I know I mispronounced. I've met him. He's a great guy. He writes wonderful, eco-dystopic fiction, and his stuff is moving, it creates, it galvanizes attention, it inspires in the most terrifying way, and in some ways it simply documents the future that we've already created in part by our actions. And then you have this piece of, really rigorous, factual science writing that's in the Times today that does most of the same things. How do you pull that apart? I don't know. I don't think you should.
I mean, I love your point about the box that we draw around science in a way that we don't other aspects, other sectors or endeavors in our culture. Meredith, I wonder, as somebody who kind of dove into that, feeling like it was a separate world from what you're doing, or was that the feeling that you had? What is that wall?
So it's interesting that when you spoke about, the person who asked about, did anyone eye roll your fiction, if it's science fiction, or are you subject to, skepticism, or does it seem less important than a literary novel that doesn't involve anything speculative? I find, as someone who wrote, to me, what is clearly a young adult romance science fiction, it's the romance part. It's the fact that it's about a young woman coping with a breakup, a woman whose science begins to be inspired by her feelings of loss. That's what's sort of belittled or eye-rolled. And Caitlin, you can probably speak to this a lot too, which is that I noticed that the minute I said, well, it's really sci-fi, because she does all this work in a lab. It's the love potion number 9 part people say, and then I say in a lab, suddenly there's respect, right? So for me,
credibility from that.
Yeah, it gets credibility. So I do find it interesting that there are so many genres and subgenres and books that are there are sci-fi books that are also business books, right? I mean, and how stories get defined. And I love Frankenstein for so many reasons, but one is that it is about grief, it is about loneliness, it is about who we become in the world and what makes a human experience. And yet one of the reasons I think it's so popular is like monster. It's like, right? I mean, so I think that often, you know, it's important to remember all of these emotional narratives that are tied to the science, and that's often, at least in my opinion, why these books become universal and so relatable. And I don't know, Caitlin, if you would have that as a fiction writer who's sort of dealing with these issues.
I mean, I would say that distinction that's often made between the emotional impulse or the emotional desire that's pushing someone to discover or follow a certain tract of knowledge, that distinction, I don't even think scientists themselves make that distinction about their work, which is kind of the heartbreaking thing. Like when we speak to scientists, oftentimes people are very transparent about the emotional reasons or reactions or motivations behind what they're doing. I have a friend who is a physicist, and I was talking to her. She's writing an essay about her mother passing away, and sort of about the metaphysical questions that come up around that. And to her, there is no distinction. You know, I was saying, you know, like there's always this question between this dichotomy between like faith and science, all these sorts of things. And she was saying, you know, like I just don't understand why people are drawing kind of these boundaries. And I think that speaks to sort of, it's like a larger question of why we have these popular narratives around creating such a huge distinction between these two things, when the people who are actually practicing science themselves rarely do, or don't necessarily think about it in that way all the time, I guess. So.
Caitlin, I wonder, with your book, as I was initially just reading some reviews of it, another book came to mind for me, and that was The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which took on some of the same issues in a biographical and autobiographical way. And I wonder, for you, there are unfortunately plenty of historical examples where you could write completely factually and historically about institutional racism and pseudoscientific racism. What's the power in fictionalizing that?
I mean, I think what we were just talking about, this question of tracking the emotional part of it, because I mean, I am biased because I'm a fiction writer, but I think the reason why fiction...
I guess the big question
yes,
is why, right?
I think the reason why fiction is so powerful, and the thing that fiction can do that films or music or other forms of art form may have a more difficult way of doing, is that when you are reading fiction, you can enter into a version of another person's consciousness very easily, especially if you're reading from the first person, but even if you're reading from a third person point of view, it is that point of view part of it, the fact that you can, if the fiction is working, you are seamlessly entering into another person's thought processes and reactions to the world. And that's an extremely powerful place to be when you are reading a book, it is a way of entering that even though you may be reading about a character who looks nothing like you, or who comes from a completely different background of you, because you are within their consciousness, you're able to see their world in a way that film, you always have still the barrier of the visual and sort of all that baggage that comes with seeing someone in front of you who does not look like you, and the extra leap to get to that form of empathy. So for me, that's why I write. That was the interesting part, and the part to the puzzle of writing the book was to get to that point and to hopefully get readers to that point, because the book is about many bad or not bad. Unfruitful choices, I will say, made in science and in life. And to get a reader to want to follow somebody making not a great choice, you really have to kind of push the empathy part of it.
If I could just jump in,
Absolutely.
that's one of the joys of nonfiction as well. I mean, I write a lot of historical stuff, and my last book, The Hunt for Vulcan, was about what happens when scientists make, with all good faith personally and good faith intellectually, good faith in the sort of domain of the work, when they make an error, what happens then? And, you know, one of the great things about the past and writing about it in nonfiction is it emphasizes the sort of the dichotomy, the strangeness. The past is not like the present. You know, they don't do things the same way. I'm butchering a famous quote there. But at the same time, you can use all the stuff you can find out that you know really happened or that people said or wrote to allow your reader to get sort of sideways into the mind of somebody who lived 200 years ago, who faced different challenges and so forth and so on, and begin to get, again, that emotional connection to a way of thinking and a way of living that isn't theirs. And, I love that.
Can I jump in on that one?
Absolutely.
I think Frankenstein is such a great sort of model of what you're both talking about, especially in terms of compassion. And I think that's one thing that science fiction just kind of stereotypically lacks. Like, I know a lot of people that I'm friends with that don't read a lot of sci-fi have the perception that it's very cold and inorganic, that feelings aren't really necessarily a big part of it. And I think Mary Shelley was so ahead of her time, not just for the entire plot of Frankenstein, but there's also the section in the book that's told from the monster's point of view. And talk about compassion. I mean, this monster, he kind of talks about, yep, I'm alone, I've been abandoned, I'm hideous, everyone hates me, I'm miserable, I'm lonely. I mean, and it's eloquent. It's intelligent, sentient, emotional, all of these things that you think, whoa, yeah, I would not have attributed this kind of horrifying, artificial life form to have. And what she does is so smart because you feel, by the end of the book, you think that the monster is more a man than Victor. I mean, they kind of cross, right? He becomes more monstrous and the monster becomes more human until they've sort of traded places by the end. And I think that way of sort of accessing compassion for the other, which is Frankenstein in this book, which could be a robot, which could be anything, was really set up by her there. So she fuses those two things together as well.
I got to say that N.K. Jemisin in her,
Yep.
in her 5th season trilogy, does a very similar move, and it's one of the things that makes that trilogy so incredibly powerful. Who knew you could make deep emotion out of plate tectonics?
I'm Heather Goldstone of Living Lab Radio. We are at WGBH's studio live at the Boston Public Library, and we're on Facebook Live. We'd love to have your comments, your questions. Tell us your favorite science fiction books. We have a question here from Tim. Is it okay to pass laws or mandates based on science fiction or speculative fiction? I mean, we've been talking about the prognostication power, also the cautionary power potentially of some of this. I mean, is Frankenstein or Gattaca is a movie, not a book, but it's like, are these things that could actually be, I don't know, substantive enough to enter into the policy world?
I think there's a big leap between saying we should be aware of the issues around this and let's pass legislation. And I think even within speculative fiction, people have sort of pushed us to think past this idea of either punishment or free for all. I think where I find sort of the value of this is forcing us to really come to terms with those ethical questions that I think can exist outside of the world of if something is ethically wrong, how can we punish people immediately for it? So I think what I think science and science writing can do is to force us to sort of think outside of that space of that as the immediate solution for these ethical questions that come up around it. There's Octavia Butler has a great essay that came out in Essence magazine right before she died called Lessons for Predicting the Future. And everyone should look it up. It's a great essay about writing about the future. It's a great essay too about just sort of living in the world. And one of the things that she says that it's sort of a roundabout answer to this question is that she was at a college and a student came up to her and said, is there any hope for the future? or what's the solution to our problems coming in the future? And she said there is no one. And what she actually meant by that is that there is no one solution, like passing a law or doing like this one thing. We are facing a myriad number of problems coming our way, and so it's going to take many, many, many different kinds of solutions to respond to that. And she said that to the student. The student went away and said, Octavia Butler sees no hope for the future. So the rest of her essay is about the difference between those two. About
that's a huge difference.
Yes, yeah.
You know, no silver bullet could be a negative thing, but it can also mean a world of opportunity.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Mike Means on our Facebook Live wants to know, and I want to know as well, your favorite science fiction books. And we have a little over 10 minutes left. I have a feeling we could probably do this for like 3 hours, right? one or two favorites.
Okay.
That we haven't. I mean, we've already hit on Frankenstein. Obviously, you love. We've hit on The Martian is on the Great American Read list. Asimov, the Foundation series, is on the Great American Read list.
Bradbury is oddly not, but yeah, Martian Chronicles for me is up there. Arthur C. Clarke I don't think was on that list either. I don't quite understand why. Childhood's End by him is one of my favorite books of all time. Oh my gosh, there's so much great sci-fi. It's so hard to say. And I actually really enjoyed Hyperion. That was one that I read not too long ago. That was a pretty awesome book as well. But yeah, I could go on forever. I'll let these folks chime in.
Caitlin.
I would say, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. I had the real honor of teaching it last semester, and of course, loving it for a very long time. You want to talk about a book that predicts the future. I mean, it predicts our current moment. I think she was off by about 6 years when she said we would have a president who would say, "Make America Great Again." But she's pretty much spot on with everything else. So, yeah, that would be my answer.
Well, I mentioned some of my favorites already. I want to draw attention back to Le Guin and the Dispossessed, which I think, it's recognized as a classic, but it's not always the first one of hers that she writes, and it is my absolute favorite of her work. I'm a huge William Gibson fan, and he really puts the speculative in speculative fiction, and he's invented new language that now has become our common, part of our common speech. Neuromancer is his sort of foundational one, but in some ways he's still learning what his brain is like in that book. And in his sort of hard cyberpunk stuff, my favorite is probably Virtual Light. And I think Pattern Recognition is one of the great novels, period, of the 21st century. I think we'll remember that book for a long time. And then I just want to say again, N.K. Jemisin, to talk about somebody who's writing explicitly science fiction and in some cases sort of speculative fantasy. She's great because, in her fantasy stuff, it's gods and magic and all sorts of stuff, but it's all about the human condition, human relations, how you deal with betrayal and all that, how do you rise above yourself, all that kind of stuff. And then when she moves into more science, science-driven thinking in the Fifth Season trilogy, she places her characters up against both knowledge and natural phenomena and says, okay, what happens now? And it's just exciting to read.
Well, I'm feeling very validated because in chemistry lessons, all of my main characters have a long conversation about The Dispossessed, which is a book I found while writing it. So I'm feeling like less imposter syndrome as I hear you recommend it. And I found that book while writing chemistry lessons on my family's bookshelf, my aunt and uncle's bookshelf, and it was inspiring. Wrinkle in Time.
Thank you. I was about
Wrinkle
to
in
say
Time.
I'm writing down her Madeline L'Engle.
Never Let Me Go, which I think is greatly influenced by Frankenstein in some wonderful ways. If we're speaking very recently, I recently read a book by Jody Lynn Anderson called Midnight at the Electric, which manages to connect the Dust Bowl and one family's history to a young woman who's chosen to go to another planet to sort of colonize for the future. And it gets into ethics, it gets into sort of how our history dictates what we're going to do after we've messed up our planet. But I'd never seen a book span so much time with science. So that's my short of a very long list.
I would say.
If I could just toss in, we didn't ask about science writing.
Oh, wow.
So
Go right ahead.
I just want to say that 2 books, I mean, there are, I don't want to say too many because they're written by my friends and they're wonderful. But James Glick's book on time travel is actually
Yes.
quite beautiful. And a book that I think got some traction, but not as broadly read as it might be, is The Lagoon, and I'm blanking on the author's name. But it's a beautiful work by a biologist looking at Aristotle at the lagoon on Lesbos, where he first thought about biology and what it now means. It's a lovely book.
Can I put a plug in there too for the Three Body Problem trilogy? I think.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, right. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a million books that I didn't name before, of course. But this one is really special, and it's written by a Chinese author, and I feel like you know that. I mean, you know this is not an American work of sci-fi from minute one, both the language and the sensibility of it, and it is an expansive trilogy with so much science. It's about aliens who are headed towards Earth, and Earth only has so much time to figure out what to do, and they know they're technologically outmatched. But yeah, I think so. I just think looking outside of the U.S. For your good sci-fi is also important.
Absolutely. Yeah, so many great reading recommendations. I'll just add two other, although as I start to, as you said, as I think of one favorite author, then another comes up and another
Right.
comes up. But two that have really stuck with me recently, Neil Stephenson's Seven Eves and Cory Doctorow, Walk Away. Are two just in the past couple of years. But Madeleine L'Engle, I have to say, for me, and this goes back to the idea that science fiction isn't always the, space and robots kind of sci-fi. I mean, I went on from reading Wrinkle in Time, which is the space and physics, to read a whole series of her young adult novels that are much lesser known about a girl growing up to become a scientist. They were hugely influential. So.
I mean, I thought about it a lot as I was writing about a young woman scientist, and if you haven't seen the movie, I also just think I love them as a couple, parents who are scientists. It's a good look.
And increasingly common. Well, that's about all the time we have. We did get one comment from Patrick, who had sent us a question earlier and said, what an excellent discussion, but alas, my lunchtime is over. Well, Patrick and anyone else who had to leave us early or needs to duck out now, you can always watch the remainder of this panel discussion and come back to it again if you need to for the reading list on Facebook. Thank you all for joining us so much. Again, our panel, we have Meredith Goldstein, we have Tom Levinson, we have Caitlin Greenidge, and we have Joelle Renstrom, and I'm Heather Goldstone of Living Lab Radio. Thank you for joining us for this Facebook Live and also live here at the Boston Public Library as part of PBS's Great American Read.